Thank you, and thank you, Chairman Leonard and members of the Planning Commission for letting me speak this evening. My name is Peter Guldberg. I'm a Michigan native, grew up in Ann Arbor. I'm an acoustic consultant with 36 years of experience. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from MIT, a Master's of Science degree in atmospheric science from the University of Michigan. I'm a certified full member of the Institute of Noise Control Engineering, certified consulting meteorologist. I've been qualified as an expert on noise in court and before public service boards. I've performed acoustic studies for 45 wind energy projects. But in addition, I've served as an independent consultant to town planning and zoning boards in several states regarding the sound effects of wind turbines. I want to talk about some of the studies that we're doing for the Blissfield Wind Energy Project, touch on sound level terms, show you some measurements of existing sound levels, speak quite a bit about low frequency infrasound and what I believe are appropriate sound limits. The decibel scale for audible sound ranges from 0 to 120 decibels. One of the nice things about it is that every time you go up 10 decibels on the scale, it's twice as loud. So one of the numbers that's easy to remember is what the sound of an average voice is in casual conversation. So if I'm talking to this gentleman here, this is 65 decibels. Now if I talk twice as loud, that's 75 decibels. If I take it back down to 65 decibels, I talk half as loud, it's like 55 decibels. So every 10 decibel change on the scale is either twice as loud or half as loud. And so typical sound levels that we see in everyday life would be a quiet rural area, might be 30 to 35 decibels, the quieter end when there's no wind. The inside of a library or an empty theater, maybe 40 to 45 decibels. Crickets and tree frogs on a summer night, 55. Conversational noise, 65 decibels. A car passing by on the road, say out here on 223, if you're standing near the road, might sound 75 decibels. What are the proper measures for sound? A-weighted decibels, as Dr. Punch gave you an introduction, are universally used for community sound studies. Why is that? Because they mimic the response of the human ear to sound in what I call the low range that you're going to hear wind turbine sound, 25 to 45 decibels. The Blissfield Wind Energy Project will be designed to a maximum of 45 decibels at any non-participating residence. On a day-to-day basis, if any sound is audible, it will be in the low range of 25 to 45 decibels. And the A scale represents how the human ear perceives that sound in that low range. Now, C scale sound levels are not valid. Why? Let me tell you that opponents, including Rick Jones, who works with Dr. Punch, have been recommending C-weighted sound scales for wind turbine studies. But the fathers of modern acoustics, both Vermont and Newman, in their Handbook of Noise Ratings, clearly state that the C scale is developed for representing how the human ear hears sound at 85 and higher decibels. In other words, the C scale is perfectly valid, but only for very loud noises. It represents how the ear works at 85, 95, 100, and on up. The A scale represents how the ear works down in the lower range. Wind turbine sound is in the 25 to 45 range. So it's scientifically invalid and inappropriate to use a C-scale decibel to represent the low-level wind turbine sound. Well, what happens if you use a C-scale? It does artificially inflate the low-frequency sound. In fact, it inflates it by 36 to 48 decibels in those bands. And opponents of wind energy projects routinely advocate for C-scale limits in local wind ordinances because they will create fictitious low-frequency sound for the wind turbines producing only 25 to 45 decibels. I'd like to share with you some measurements of existing sound levels from the project area, which includes Palmyra, Ogden, and Riga townships. These measurements were taken last fall out in the open farmland in each of the 3 townships. We found that existing sound levels away from major roads such as 223, for example, are determined by local roadway traffic, farm equipment, wind turbulence, noise, aircraft occasionally overhead, and natural sounds like flocks of birds. The wind turbines that are used in a project like this start up their operation at what we call a startup speed of 10 miles an hour at the hub. And the design wind speed is 22 miles an hour up at the hub. And the design wind speed is the speed at which the turbine first produces its maximum sound. So our studies looking at the possible acoustic effects of wind turbines always refer to the design wind speed and assume that the turbines are turning it and producing their maximum power and their maximum sound. Now, during the week that we took those measurements, we found that existing sound levels ranged from 37 to 73 decibels, a very wide range, as you would expect across the 3 townships, when there's sufficient wind for the turbine operation. One of the interesting statistics from those measurements is that the median level during periods when there would be sufficient wind for turbine operation is 57 decibels. And existing sound levels are above 45 more than 90% of the time when the turbines would operate. The significance of that, again, is that Great Lakes wind would be designed to a maximum of 45 decibels at a nearest non-participating occupied house. And more than 90% of the time when the turbines would operate, existing sound levels are already above 45 decibels. Low frequency sound and infrasound seem to be the issues most in people's minds. So let me make 3 statements about them, and then let me show you measurements from Palmyra and Riga townships to try and interpret these statements. The first one is that natural low frequency and infrasound are always present in a rural environment. Many people don't understand that. Infrasound isn't something that's just produced by a wind turbine. In fact, there's infrasound produced by any sort of machine, a truck, a lawnmower, and anyone with a somewhat low voice. I'm producing some infrasound right now as well. I'm producing a whole spectrum of sound. Infrasound is just the very low frequency sound. That's all it means. At the design wind speed, the wind turbine low frequency and infrasound are similar to the natural background already existing in a rural area. I will show you that. And finally, the low frequency and infrasound from the project will be inaudible and it will produce no adverse health effects. So I guess we were asked for some evidence that this project will not cause adverse health effects. I'd be glad to provide some of that. This is a chart of the frequency spectrum of sound measurements. So if you give me a minute just to give you a tour of what this chart means. We have down here the sound frequency on the horizontal axis, and these are unweighted decibels with the third denominator here on the vertical axis. The human voice is in this range, 1,000 hertz. That's where our hearing is most acute. So this end is high frequency sound, this end is low frequency sound. And in fact, 16 hertz down here, this band down here is infrasound. This is an infrasound band down here. These colored lines, with the exception of the green one, I'll come back to the green one. These colored lines are measurements that were made in Palmyra Township and Riga Township out in open farmland, not near 223 or Interstate Highway, last fall. And each line shows the spectrum. In other words, how many decibels in each of these bands and frequencies. And the shape of this graph is typical. You could go out in any area of America today, suburban, rural, and take sound measurements, and you will get a graph that looks like this. It slopes down from left to right. In other words, if you put sound levels unweighted on a graph like this, they're higher in the very low frequencies, and the infrasound can slope down towards the high frequencies. So there's nothing unusual about these measurements from Palmyra or Riga, except that they're probably a little lower than you would find in Ann Arbor or Detroit, certainly. This dashed line here, I can call your attention to it, is the International Isostable Hearing Threshold. So at an infrasound frequency of 16 hertz, and 16 cycles per second in the sound plane, the hearing threshold is 90 on the scale. So if there is a sound in that infrasound that's below 90, you don't hear it. If it's above 90, there is generally some perception of hearing. And this dash line comes down because we don't hear very low frequency or infrasound unless it's extremely loud. But the mid frequencies and the high frequencies we do hear. So the way to interpret this is everything to the left and below this dash line is inaudible. What's to the right is audible sound. Now I want to call your attention to the green line. The green line is the total sound level from a wind energy project using the turbine that Great Lakes Wind is likely to use for this project. The total from all nearby turbines at a house, non-participating house, let's say, that happened to be right at the limit of 45 decibels. Not that we would design the project for anybody to be right at the limit, but let's show you what the sound spectrum would look like for somebody who lived at a 45 decibel broadband limit. And that's this green line. In the infrasound range, 64 decibels at 16 hertz, and then falling off like this. So there's a couple of points I want to make. Once we understand that the colored lines are actual measurements of existing sound levels today under the design wind conditions. In other words, when there's sufficient wind to produce the maximum sound power from the turbine, which corresponds to this green line. All of our studies to prove compliance with an ordinance, whether it be a local or a county ordinance, assume the maximum sound power. So the first point is that the shape of the frequency spectrum for existing sound levels in a rural area, specifically in Palmyra, is very similar to the shape of the spectrum for the wind turbine sound. There is not anything special or very different about the spectrum of the wind turbine sound. The next thing I want to point out is that when you get into a very low frequency, say below about 40 hertz here, that the sound from existing background sounds, and we've listed those before, it's road rage traffic, whether it's nearby or it's half mile away or it's a mile away, etc. It's aircraft at a distance, it's farm equipment, it's other activities of human society. That the very low frequency sound below about 40 hertz here is inaudible, as is the very low frequency in infrasound from the wind turbine. The level of infrasound from the wind turbines on this project are very similar to the existing sound levels out there today under the same conditions, the design wind conditions, when the turbine would be producing its maximum power and its maximum sound. There's been peer-reviewed research, I think Dr. Punch referred to it, that shows that there are some documented adverse health effects for exposure to low frequency and infrasound. But that's at levels 20 to 25 decibels above the hearing threshold. Those are the only really nailed down peer-reviewed results. What I want you to notice is that the max...
Is that the NASA study?
The NASA study is one example of that, yes. I want you to notice that rather than being 20 to 25 decibels above the hearing threshold, which would be up here, the maximum infrasound on this wind energy project is 25 decibels below the hearing threshold at 16 hertz. Now, whereas the natural low frequency in infrasound presumably is not harming people today, these colored lines are not harming people today. It's hard to see how the turbine, low frequency in infrasound here, the green line, would be producing adverse health effects in people at the relatively low level that it would occur. So that's what I come back to one of the statements on my earlier slide, that the low frequency in infrasound is not significant and it's not special when you view it in the context of existing sound levels today without the interval. Now, there are claims by opponents such as Pierpont and others that there are some of these symptoms that she calls interval syndrome. But if you read Pierpont's self-published study closely, you'll see that she's referring to low-frequency sound impacts on health stemming from a NASA study done in the 1960s. And in that study, military men stood next to a jet engine while it was operating, and they were exposed to 110 to 150 decibels of infrasound. Let me put that in perspective. That's 100 million times more sound energy than would be ever received from a wind turbine, as shown in the previous. So it's just not comparable. You don't experience the types of tickling in the ears, the pressure in the chest that the NASA study, that the men in the NASA study reported, the dizziness at 110 to 150 decibels. You don't experience that when the infrasound level is down in the range of existing background levels in a rural area, which I just showed you on the previous slide. They will. There are also claims by Dr. Alex Salt, that Dr. Punch mentioned, and others that low-frequency sound you cannot hear somehow, is eating away at your insides. It's adversely affecting you. You should know that Dr. Alex Salt's work involves laboratory experiments on guinea pigs, and that guinea pigs' ears are very sensitive to low-frequency sound, unlike human ears. There's a significant difference in the structure of a guinea pig ear. The helicotrema, which is a filter, that structure acts as a very effective filter to prevent low-frequency sound getting into the hair cells in the human ear canals, is relatively ineffective in the guinea pig ear. So his research may be perfectly proper and accurate with regard to the responses of guinea pigs to low-frequency sound, but frankly, that has nothing to do with the way that the human ear responds to low-frequency sound. I want to shift now to what we believe would be a proper sound limit for this project. A 45 decibel, 45 dBA limit at non-participating occupied structures day or night is the appropriate limit for a wind energy project